There's been a lot of talk recently about the rise of the online right's presence in recent years. Right-wing podcasts dominate left-wing ones easily, and this has left many progressives clamoring for a left-wing Joe Rogan. I've seen many people scared of this turn of events, and I find that perfectly understandable. But I also feel that many have let that fear turn into hopelessness, and while I think it would be wrong to say that everything's fine, I find that hopelessness to be both unfounded and counterproductive. To say I got the inspiration for this video by watching a creator by the name of Zed Tabani. Tabani has spent a significant degree of his time noting similarities between our current political moment and the year 2005, and it's caused me to reflect upon past experiences of my own that bear striking similarities to the current moment. I bring this stuff up because this isn't the first time right-wingers had a vice grip over online political content. From 2014 to 2017, most political content online was right-wing. Left-wingers were routinely mocked for making even milquetoast left-wing observations, and complaining about receiving death threats would get you castigated for being an oversensitive snowflake. I'm not making that last part up, by the way. Here's a prominent video from a creator in that space saying just that. For those years, these right-wing content creators, who were known colloquially as the Skeptic or anti-SJW community, were thought of as invincible. And then that bubble popped. Left-wing YouTube channels started getting off the ground, with folks like Bomberguy and Sarah Zed being thought of not just as great leftist essayists, but just good essayists in general. Prominent right-wing channels started getting banned, and this community that once seemed invincible started to fade from the mainstream. This shift towards the left was beautiful, but the reasons for it don't seem to be well discussed or documented, and I think that's a shame, because I think it's important to talk about ways that the world has gotten better, because it goes a long way towards showing younger people that they can win. I think it shows that fighting the good fight is something other than a pointless waste of time. So I think that it's going to be very important to discuss the reasons why this community fell. And I think that a good way to understand how this came about is to understand how this community's content was made and why. In his video, The Strange Death of YouTube Skepticism, the video essayist Big Joel argues that one of the major reasons the right managed to establish a foothold in YouTube before the left did was because the right based their content around being entertaining, while the left based their content around being informative. To the average viewer, the content made by the right would scan as some fun trash TV to put on in your spare time, while the content the left made would feel like homework to read up on. This ended up giving the right a significant leg up in the online sphere, because they were able to collect audience members from a pool of people who weren't super into politics, while the left relied largely on people who were dedicated to the cause. This gave the right a significant numerical advantage, and left progressives in an online space where they were significantly outnumbered by those hostile to them, which is something that's going to become important later. Natalie Wynn of Counterpoint's fame pointed out in her video Cringe that right-wing content from this era was basically a 21st century freak show. This entertainment was less about making coherent arguments or observations, and more about giving you examples of people considered deviant for the audience to gawk at. They tended to have titles like SJW's Owned or Feminist Faces Karma. This is important to note, because what the individual entertainers themselves brought to the table was often bad. And I don't mean morally, I mean as entertainment. Unless you look down on the folk these videos were made to mock, this shit will be extremely boring to watch. The videos they produced often went off on wild tangents. They often provided little to no evidence for any of their claims. And moreover, these videos were often very repetitive and straight up plagiarized. The YouTuber Bomberguy made a two-part video on the right's response to Bill Nye that discusses this in more detail. The repetitive nature of this content isn't by accident. In the video How to Radicalize a Normie, the channel Innuendo Studios, run by Ian Danskin, argues that right-wing content is repetitive because it serves to provide its viewers with a constant sense of reassurance. It exists to provide the viewer with the feeling of being rational through aesthetic things like the tone of the speaker's voice and their confidence, without actually engaging in the sort of logical reasoning that doing so would require. Danskin points out that this comes with a trade-off, because a logical argument only needs to be internalized once. If you understand what someone is saying and you know how to explain it, you will have a pretty easy time understanding why the belief that the argument upholds is correct. The arguments made by anti-SJWs, however, rely on a feeling of rationality based on aesthetics, and that feeling is fickle. It doesn't last unless you work to actively maintain it by regularly watching Skeptic community content. Danskin states that the arguments are repetitive because they're not good. Finally, the biggest force behind the right's dominance of the YouTube sphere was by far harassment. The anti-SJW era was kickstarted by a harassment campaign called Gamergate. If you want to learn more about the specifics of the campaign, I recommend you watch this video. But I'm largely going to be focusing on the campaign's main target, a woman by the name of Anita Sarkeesian. Sarkeesian attracted the ire of the online right because he made a series of video essays called Tropes vs. Women in Video Games, which analyzed women's portrayal in video games through a feminist lens. Due to her making these essays, the right decided that she was essentially the devil reborn, and a presence who must be destroyed. They framed her as an authoritarian monster who was out to take away your video games. This isn't to say there were no good critiques of her. You can watch this video if you'd like to see some. But it is to say that the right's response was wildly disproportionate, because no matter how bad someone's video essays are, it's not a justification to treat them as a she-beast plotting to destroy Western society. This obsessive vitriol during Sarkeesian was inescapable during this time, and I think that the best illustration of that would be an incident that occurred in VidCon during 2017. We'll take it from the top and go from there. Carl Benjamin, better known as Sargon of Akkad, was one of the biggest names in the Gamergate movement. He was someone who regularly engaged in painting Sarkeesian as a cancerous scourge upon gaming. At VidCon 2017, Sarkeesian was a speaker at a panel on harassment against women. Benjamin, along with several others looking to cancel her, made sure to pack the 3 rows nearest to Sarkeesian on one side. Sarkeesian ended up noticing Benjamin and called him out for essentially being part of a cottage industry dedicated to tarring her name, and she called him a garbage human. The online right generally defended themselves by arguing that all Benjamin was doing was simply sitting in the audience. This falls apart for a few reasons. First, Benjamin had a history of castigating Sarkeesian as a satanic figure of sorts. If you spend your day-to-day presenting someone as the ultimate threat to Western civilization, and yet then show up to a place that they're attending, it's pretty obvious you're there for a reason. Secondly, Benjamin stated that he intended to use the Q&A session to interact with her directly. When you do that, you're not just a passive observer anymore, since you are using that forum to go after her. Third, according to this article, one of Benjamin's cronies, a fellow by the name of Dave Cullen, released a vlog that detailed his plans to pack the first 3 rows, in which he ends up letting it slip that they did it with the explicit intention of getting under her skin. Now, Cullen deleted his first channel, Computing Forever, so I couldn't find this vlog at first, which was a shame, since I like making absolutely sure that I have an accurate understanding of what has transpired. Thankfully, one anti-SJW commentator made a dramatic reading of the article I'm citing, and that dramatic reading features audio from the vlog showing Cullen saying everything that the article alleges. So there we have it. There is a video proof that one of Benjamin's associates that directly contradicts his claims. The online right then turned around and tried to argue that it was Sarkeesian who abused Benjamin by calling him a garbage human. Which, for a group that likes to argue that you should be allowed to say anything, is pretty ironic. Especially when you consider how milquetoast her comments actually were. Benjamin even tried to argue that Sarkeesian should be deplatformed over the incident in a now-deleted video that is preserved on archive.org. In this video, he goes on to state that he's anti-harassment because he advised the public not to contact Sarkeesian, whilst admitting that he went to VidCon specifically to contact Sarkeesian. This kind of harassment created an environment in which those who disagreed with the right were scared of receiving untold amounts of reputational damage if they expressed such opinions. What the right did was, ironically enough, a form of large-scale cancel culture. The problem was made worse by the fact that, for most of this era, there weren't many left-wing political channels with the necessary clout to push back against this shit. This created a situation where, if someone was looking for videos to help learn more about politics, they were going to end up running into the right. They would only see one side of the argument, and thus, they would end up with a skewed view of reality. Now that we've gone into how this content became popular, I think it's time for us to look into how it all fell apart. As with many social trends, the reason the skeptic community fell apart comes down less due to one specific thing, and more due to a confluence of factors bringing them down. So I'll try to summarize each of them as best I can, from order of least important to most important. I think that one of the earliest cracks in the online right's political dominance was something called the Candid scandal. For those who don't know, the skeptic community took sponsors from an app called Candid that marketed itself as a free speech alternative to more mainstream social media sites. This app, however, had a nasty habit of shadow banning people that was never disclosed in any of these sponsorships. This naturally caused a lot of controversy. The skeptic community initially responded by trying to claim that what Candid was doing wasn't a violation of their values, or by claiming that it was good. This, unsurprisingly, ended up failing, and most of the videos hawking Candid were eventually taken down. If you want to learn more about this subject, I recommend you watch Turkey Tom's video on the topic, though I'm not a fan of him personally due to him making some questionable comments about Jewish people, which you can learn more about in this video. The fact that the videos featuring Candid sponsorships were taken down demonstrates these videos were considered unacceptable amongst many members of their fan bases, and likely caused a lot of their viewers to have a harder time trusting those channels in the future. Another crack would be more subtle, and it's something that I only really noticed by paying attention to the anti-woke bandwagon and the people who left it. In the video Why I Stopped Being Anti-Woke by Darkmather2525, the narrator discusses this term away from the anti-woke crowd after joining it in the 2016 era. The narrator states that he hopped on the bandwagon because he noticed certain traits amongst members of the left, such as being easily offended, hypocritical, and lacking in self-awareness. He ended up mistakenly chalking up these traits to being part of the left, rather than coming to the understanding that these traits were attributes that could be present in anyone of any disposition. He states that his anti-woke stances were derived from him misattributing these traits to left-wingers, rather than any policy disagreements, and that is what's important here. In the video How to Fall Down the Anti-SJW Rabbit Hole, the YouTuber Tree Arrows notes that one of the big issues with the anti-SJW content of this era is that it doesn't provide you with much of a stable ideology beyond hating lefties. He notes that when Trump won, the anti-SJW celebrated less because they thought he would make a good president, but instead because he made the left mad. The anti-SJW community was less pro-right than it was anti-left. And this would end up putting the community in a serious pickle, because it meant that if conservatives started making decisions that harmed the majority of Americans, large portions of the community would not necessarily be on board with that. This inevitably led to conflicts happening between the parts of the community who were in because they had pro-right political beliefs, and those who were just there to dunk on people they thought were idiots. There were multiple examples of this happening with prominent figures. For example, Thunderfoot got into a spat with the aforementioned Carl Benjamin due to the latter's pro-Brexit views. TJ Kirk made a video called Impeach Trump, or How I Learned to Stop Fence Riding and Hate the President, which details how he went from thinking Trump is bad, but not much worse than any other politician, to calling for his impeachment. There was also the YouTuber Chris Reagan, who made a video called Anti-SJWs Hate Him, detailing his own disillusionment with the anti-SJW community. The community was far more internally divided than it appeared, and it would only take the right type of pressure to bring those divides bubbling to the surface. And that brings us to the election of a very controversial president. Come 2016, the unthinkable happened. Donald Trump won the presidency. The skeptic community rejoiced over this fact because it angered the lefties. One woman who cried because she recognized the threat that Trump posed was copied and pasted into 1,000 SJW cringe compilations. The anti-SJW community seemed unstoppable. And then something peculiar happened. Trump's decisions ended up alienating a significant portion of his base. As it turns out, individuals with wits that make drunken toddlers look like the pinnacle of genius have a habit of making decisions that upset people. Who could have guessed? This ended up being documented in a video called Fate of the Frogmen, which goes over how a notable portion of the online right ended up regretting their decision to back Trump, as well as how he got them to back him in the first place. Making this issue worse is the fact that a significant portion of the community were never fans of Trump to begin with. For example, Chris Reagan, in a now deleted video called Trump Up the Jams, said that he didn't like Trump or Clinton, and that he was just entertained by how people reacted to his inauguration. And TJ Kirk started out thinking that Trump was shit, but not much worse than any other politician. This meant that the more moderate members of the community were finding themselves surrounded by people they considered idiots. This naturally worsened the aforementioned divides. The uglier side of the community was starting to show itself out in the open, and many of the normies started to get scared. This phenomenon intensified during August of 2017, when one of the ugliest chapters in modern American history transpired.
Jews will not replace us! Jews will not replace us! Jews will not replace us! Blood and soil! Blood and soil! Blood and soil!
On the 11th of August 2017, a man by the name of Jason Kessler held a rally in the town of Charlottesville, Virginia, protesting the removal of a statue of Robert E. Lee. The rally, which prominently touted speakers such as Richard Spencer and Nick Fuentes as headline acts, featured scenes such as Nazis marching with tiki torches in hand, repeatedly shouting, "Jews will not replace us." Violent clashes broke out between demonstrators and counter-protesters, and near the end of the rally, a man by the name of James Alex Fields drove his car into a crowd of counter-protesters, killing a woman by the name of Heather Heyer. This event was nothing less than a horrific display of bigotry. But it did come with a silver lining. It ended up demonstrating to the world that fascists were a genuine political presence in the US of A. And it caused many people who thought that any and all accusations of fascism were just slander to reconsider their position. As ContraPoint showed in her video, How to Recognize a Fascist, there was a major problem of centrists unwittingly parroting alt-right talking points during this time. And I think that the rally served as a major wake-up call to many of those centrists. A video that did a good job of exposing this issue, the skeptic and alt-right problem, goes over the alt-right's control over this community in great detail. This might be hard for some of you to believe, but during 2016, there was a period of time where people were openly questioning whether or not Richard Spencer was a fascist. You can find big names within the community, such as Chris Reagan touting Spencer's allegiance to fascism, though I should note that Reagan has since admitted that he fucked up there, and that Spencer was very obviously a Nazi. The events of this rally were a serious blow to many of the prevailing narratives of the time. Yet, that's not the biggest factor in the skeptic community's downfall. The biggest blow is something subtle, something you wouldn't think about unless you were paying close attention. It's something embedded in the very structure of their content. Do you remember how I told you that the skeptic community got its viewers by selling its content as a source of entertainment instead of education? Well, this put the community in something of a bind. Because the content got you to swallow its bullshit by repeatedly drilling the affect of rationality into its viewer through repetition. This ensured that the skeptics were an inherently self-destructive niche. Because, for all you can say about repetitive slop, you can't deny that it gets a little boring after a while. If a significant chunk of your audience is there to be entertained, and you stop being entertaining, people leave. Making matters worse was the aforementioned plagiarism. The skeptic community's bad habit of constantly copying each other's homework created a situation where if you watched one of their videos on a specific topic, you had pretty much seen them all. This created an environment where these channels ended up splitting up their casual viewers into increasingly smaller slivers of audience share. This caused their views to crater, and thus they lost favor with the algorithm. Making this issue worse is the fact that a lot of these channels, like No Bullshit and Sargon of Akkad, were content farms that often uploaded multiple times in a week. That kind of schedule can leave your audience worn out, because you're releasing more content than they can engage with. For all the terrible things you can say about the skeptic community, their biggest weakness wasn't their bigotry or their infighting. It was the fact that they were unbelievably boring. And now we are left with one last thing to discuss: the rise of BreadTube. The skeptic community spent their years of dominance continually harassing anyone who dared to even vaguely imply that there might be something worth looking at in leftist politics. And that scared a lot of people off. But some folk persisted. These people chose to make left-wing art not because it was easy, but because it was right. And they ended up building an audience, because, as it turns out, a lot of people hold left-wing beliefs. And so we started to gain an online presence. And unlike the right, our creators had things that set them apart from each other. We had folk who focused on media analysis like Lindsay Ellis, individuals who had a focus on history like Three Arrows, differing styles of entertainment such as the madcap antics of H. Bomber Guy contrasted by the dry wit of Sean, and crucially, they took time between releasing videos, because they knew that it was better to make a good video every once in a while than to make crappy videos on a constant basis. This ensured that they never outstayed their welcome. The fact that the left had gained figures who were respected by the internet at large was also huge because it meant that when the right started harassing people, there were people who could call them out on it, and cause them massive reputational damage in the process. This helped to open a door that allowed many of the folk who could never deal with the skeptic community's harassment to finally start speaking their minds publicly, and it helped to massively advance the aims of the left. I'm not going to pretend that we live in some kind of fairy tale world where the good guys always win, because we don't. But I would like to say that the reason we managed to get this far as a community is because there were people who were willing to fight losing battles. People who stuck by their principles even though it cost them. And thanks to people like that, we managed to make great strides. I don't just mean in terms of breadtube. I mean this in terms of advancements in the rights of women, black people, and queer folk. The only reason we managed to defeat so many of this world's evils is because we stuck to our guns and were willing to fight against the odds. And if you end up coming away from this video with any particular lesson in mind, I want it to be that.